Hello, and welcome to Capital Compass. We are the official podcast of the New York State Catholic Conference. I'm your host, Gillian. Today, in episode 42, I'll be talking with Dennis Poust, Executive Director of the New York State Catholic Conference, about the 2025 legislative session priorities. Today, I'm joined with Dennis Poust, Executive Director of the New York State Catholic Conference, to talk about the 2025 legislative session priorities. On January 8th, the 2025 New York State legislative session began. The Democrats continue to hold the majority in both the State Senate and the Assembly. Additionally, on January 14th, Governor Hochul gave her State of the State address and released her executive budget on January 21st. In it, she listed her plans to, quote-unquote, put money in New Yorkers' pockets and make our state safer. We have a good amount to go over, so before we dive into specific legislation, can you tell our listeners what we expect from this legislative session?
Sure. Well, I guess as with any legislative session, we expect the unexpected. There are some things we do know. As you mentioned, Governor Hochul released her executive budget this past week, which piggybacks on her State of the State. So we kind of know what her priorities are, and we like some of them, to be honest. For example, we liked the expansion of the child tax credit that she's proposing to give, I believe, $1,000 per child up to age 4, and then $500 for older children up to age 16. That's real money for struggling families, and it will help, we believe, people to raise their families in dignity. In a similar way, she's proposing $1,200 cash infusion for low-income individuals upon the birth of a child. Again, we don't use the term pro-life very often when it comes to Governor Hochul, but that's a pro-life policy, and she needs to be applauded for it. She should be applauded for it. But unfortunately, on the other side of the coin, are anti-life policies related to abortion. Just throwing money, really, at Planned Parenthood with a $25 million allocation to a reproductive equity fund, which is just really a slush fund, and also additional $10 million, I believe, for infrastructure in abortion clinics. So a lot of giveaways to the abortion industry. It's to be expected in New York. We do applaud the governor, though, for some balance, which is more than we've seen with her immediate predecessor, in terms of trying to help moms and families. So that's a good thing.
So another major item from the governor's State of the State address was her proposal to provide free breakfast and lunch to all students in New York. Do you know if that proposal would extend to Catholic schools and other private schools, or is it just limited to public education?
It's kind of a complicated question, easy question, complicated answer, let's say. It does apply to non-public schools. That's the easy answer, but only if they are participating in the federal free lunch program or free and reduced lunch program. So many of our schools have cafeterias and participate in that, especially our high schools, but many of our elementary schools. Some of our smaller schools do not participate, and so they wouldn't be eligible for this state expansion of the free meal program. But any school that participates in the federal program should be able to also get the state expansion.
Are there any other things we can see that will be benefiting Catholic schools, or is it another uphill battle?
It's always an uphill battle, especially because, as you know, it's harder and harder for parents to afford our schools. We keep them as affordable as we can, but the reality is we have to pay our teachers a just wage. We have to pay for upkeep, pay for increased heating and energy costs. All of that gets passed on to the parents because, unlike most states, there is no school choice in New York. There is no mechanism for parents to access government funds or even to encourage people to give to scholarship funds like the education tax credit that we proposed here many years ago. So it becomes more difficult for our schools, unfortunately. That would be the game changer. There are things in the budget that will help our schools. We always get aid for mandated services. We could probably use more of that. We get aid for non-public school safety and security grants, and then things like hardware aid, library aid, instructional materials, all that stuff. And very importantly for our high schools in particular, we can access reimbursement for teachers who teach STEM courses as well as art and music courses, as long as they are secular and they don't teach religion courses, because then we run into First Amendment issues. But when they teach those secular subjects, we are eligible to get some reimbursement. And that's been a big help to some of our high schools.
I do want to get back to education later in this conversation, but on the federal level.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to statewide issues, Assisted suicide is once again being pushed by advocates in New York. At the same time, Governor Hochul and many legislators have also prioritized suicide prevention efforts. Do you see these two goals as being kind of a contradiction? How does the conference approach these complex issues?
Yeah, you hit on a really good point there, and it's a complete contradiction. Yeah, we spend a fortune in this state, and rightly so, on suicide prevention efforts. We have a mental health crisis in our state, and it's really impacting people across the spectrum, but especially young people. And we've seen more of it since the pandemic. So the state is seeing these trends, and they are prioritizing funding efforts to reduce teen suicide, suicide among young adults, and suicide really among all people. Then on the other side of the coin, we have legislators who are proposing to allow assisted suicide. They don't want to call it assisted suicide, right? Because they know that that's a toxic term, rightly so. So they twist themselves into knots calling it medical aid in dying. But we know what it is. It is helping patients to commit suicide because society perhaps deems their lives less worthy of living than other people. It's a terrible policy. We've seen terrible results of people with mental illness, even things like anorexia or depression being approved for assisted suicide in other countries, even in Canada. So it's our top priority. It remains our top priority to defeat this bill. And it does get harder every year because our opponents are pretty well funded and well organized.
Now, switching over to the federal level, we've seen significant shifts in power, with the Republicans taking over the Senate and maintaining control of the House alongside the election of President Donald Trump as our 47th president. How do you think these changes will impact the legislative agenda, particularly when it comes to issues for Catholics? Are there pieces of legislation we're closely monitoring that align with Catholic social teaching?
Well, we're just getting started, and what we saw from the president in his initial days were a slew of executive orders, some of which will probably be overturned by the courts, some of which may be upheld, some we like. For example, clarifying that there are two genders, male and female, and sort of ending some of the gender ideology that's kind of taken hold in our government and infected some of our schools and sports programs. So we like that, but then on the other hand are some of these many immigration-related executive orders, and I think we'll see legislation too. We understand very well, and we agree, the government has a right and a duty to protect our borders, and Americans have been pretty clear that they want people who commit violence to not be here, and rightly so. But we're very concerned about where this is headed in terms of the rhetoric coming from the president and some of these executive orders.
We've seen recent statements come out from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops about all these migration things. Additionally, we've seen different Catholic charities, organizations, and different dioceses come out with statements. The Catholic Church has long held a stance on the humane treatment of migrants and refugees. Could you elaborate the Church's position on issues like mass deportations and the treatment of undocumented individuals?
Yeah, very clearly. Mass deportations, Pope Francis has already come out and said that would be a disgrace. Again, as I said a minute ago, we appreciate and agree that the government has a duty to protect our borders and to set immigration policy. People should not be coming here who don't belong here. And the state has a duty to protect the citizens. Nobody has a problem with removing violent individuals who are here illegally and setting some parameters on immigration. But what we're seeing so far are promises of mass deportations. We've already seen some raids of people, of groups. We're seeing a lot of fear in the immigrant community. You're hearing anecdotally of farm workers who are not showing up for work to pick crops because they're afraid of ICE raids. They're hearing of school children being locked down in their schools because of large percentage of undocumented students in these schools. People shouldn't have to live this way. We're also hearing that of late that some folks who came here under the previous administration through legal means, who didn't sneak across the border but came through and are seeking asylum here and are awaiting court cases, may be sent back. And they followed the rules at the time. And so we have to use the term humane, and we have to remember the humanity of everyone. Everyone is made in the image and likeness of God, wherever they were born. And yes, we need to get a hold of our immigration policy, and we need immigration reform, but it has to be done humanely and with respect for individuals. The president may see a mandate to address this problem, and that's true, but he doesn't have a mandate to treat people who are made in the image and likeness of God as less worthy. And so we need to remember that, and we hope that these policies are just and merciful.
Taking a turn, we recently sent out an alert to our network about the Educational Choice for Children Act, also known as ECCA. For listeners who might not be familiar with the bill, could you explain what the ECCA would do? How could this legislation impact families, especially those seeking more educational options for their children, and how does it align with Catholic teaching on education and parental rights?
Sure. Well, the Educational Choice for Children Act, the ECCA, is, as you said, it's a federal bill, but it's very similar to what we tried to enact in New York State in the last decade. It's an education investment tax credit. And what that means is that if a family or an individual or a corporation made a donation to a scholarship granting organization, and every diocese in our state has one of these organizations, right? So like the Inner City Scholarship Fund in the Archdiocese of New York, or Beacon of Hope in the Diocese of Albany, they all have them. If someone were to make a donation to a scholarship fund, they can get a tax credit for the full amount of that donation. Currently, you get a tax deduction, which is a lot less generous than a tax credit. So what it does is incentivizes giving to these organizations, which in turn give scholarships to needy children. And in terms of Catholic social teaching, to your question, the church teaches that parents are the first educators of their children, and they have the right to direct the education of their child. That means being able to choose the best school environment for their kids. And for too many of our families, they don't have that choice because they have to go to the public school, even if it's a failing school in an inner city, because they can't afford the tuition at the non-public schools, such as our great Catholic schools, which do a phenomenal job in terms of educating kids and getting them ready for college and life beyond.
We just kind of scratched the surface and the main topics of these things going on within the state and federal government. For our listeners who want to get involved, how can they make their voices heard and stay engaged with all these important issues?
Well, follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on X, and join the Catholic Action Network. I know you'll do a promo and tell people how to do that. It's really important, and people who are regular listeners to this podcast may just sort of gloss over that you make that pitch, but it's really important. You can sign up via text, you could sign up via email. You find out what's going on in state government and federal legislation, and you have an ability to act, to contact your legislators. We write the messages for you. You can edit them, but it's super easy. I just recently did it for the ECCA alert that you mentioned, and it took me about 10 seconds to reach out to my member of Congress and to our 2 senators and to tell them I support this bill. It's super easy. Go to nyscatholic.org and sign up.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gillian.
If you'd like to get involved and stay up to date with New York State legislation relevant to the Catholic Church, sign up for our Catholic Action Network. We send out alerts to help you contact your legislators, as well as monthly updates during the legislative session to keep you informed about what's happening in Albany. You can sign up by visiting our website at nyscatholic.org/action-center or by texting CAN, C-I-N, to 50457. Again, that's CAN to 50457. Thanks for listening to the Capital Compass podcast, and thank you so much to Dennis for coming on the show. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be coming out with a new episode the last Wednesday of each month. If you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And to catch all the latest from the conference, you can follow us on Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter, at NYS Catholic Conf, and on Facebook at NYS Catholic Conference. Thanks again, and God bless.